Welcome to the Pathways Research and Training Center September 18th webinar, Findings from a Study of a Skills Enhancement Intervention for Peer Support Providers Working with Youth and Young Adults. I'm Emily Taylor. I'm the Disseminations Manager for Pathways, and I get to start out with these general household items, so this will go as smoothly as possible. These are kind of the general guidelines for GoToWebinar. We find the sound is best if you use the dial-in. Everyone will be muted during the presentation except for the presenters, but we encourage you to chat us any questions you have, and we will try to get to all of them during our Q&A. If there's any we aren't able to get to, we will reply by email. So if you would like to include your email, that will help us. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our presenters.
Well, thank you, Emily, and welcome everyone. This is Janet Walker speaking. As you can see there on the screen, I'm a research professor at Portland State University. I'm also principal investigator for the various Achieve My Plan projects. And if you're interested, you can see a little bit more about how I describe my research in the box there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Baird. I'm a project manager and trainer with Pathways Research and Training Center. I also have lots of experience working directly with transition-age youth as a wraparound peer support partner, and I am a former manager of peer support specialists, both in drop-in center settings and in wraparound and on treatment teams.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Beth Welch. I'm a peer support training specialist on various AMP projects and on the AMP Plus project primarily. And I have lived experience in multiple systems: mental health care system, foster care system, special education system. I use my experience as a youth in those systems to be a peer when I was a peer, and also now as a peer trainer.
So we just want to clarify before we start the presentation what we mean when we're talking about peer support here. So we're talking about young adult peer support. So this is young adults who are often near peer providers. That means somebody who maybe is not the same age as the young person but close in age, who are working with youth and young adults that experience serious mental health conditions and who have their own lived experience as a youth or young adult in one or more systems. So that can include mental health, juvenile justice, foster care, special ed, and others. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to start off with a little poll. You will have just a few seconds to answer. So we want to learn a little bit about what your role is. Are you a peer support specialist, a peer supervisor or manager of a program that uses peer support, a professional who is working with peers, an adult or family peer provider, supervisor, or team member, or you've never directly worked with young adult peer support providers?
The majority were 36% are peers, supervisor or managers, 23% are professional that works with peers, and 21% peer support specialists.
Excellent.
Sounds like we have a good group.
Well, we appreciate that you've all joined us today. A brief review of our agenda. So we're going to talk about the state of the science and some of the information that we presented there. We're also, of course, going to talk about the AMP Plus project. That's going to include elements of the enhancement intervention as well as our specific training approach. We'll also talk about findings from the training project, and we'll have some discussion and some time for questions, and we'll review some resources that you can use after the training as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the intervention. So AMP Plus is an intervention that's intended for peer support specialists, and the idea is to give peer support specialists specific tools for their work with young people that allows them to create some structure that's still youth-driven but doesn't dilute the peer-to-peer relationship. This helps provide some role clarity for peers, as well as provide just a little bit of guidance on what it is that they can do to help use some strategies and some techniques for youth to come up with their own ideas about their goals and dreams. So we're going to talk a little bit about our personal experience. So as somebody who worked as a peer support specialist, peers are often expected to fill multiple roles, which can create confusion for both them and the young person, and then boundaries are sometimes blurred. So I'm sure that those of you who are on the webinar working as peer support specialists have experienced some of this. Sometimes you're expected to be the case manager, the therapist, as well as the cab driver. And there can be a lot of confusion about what the peer support role is actually intended to do. Peer support specialists, as we know, are community-based and often don't have coworkers who share their role. In my experience, usually there was maybe 1 to 3 peer support specialists working within an organization, so pretty limited. The AMP+ coaching and feedback model allows these peers to gain more direct feedback and feel a little bit less lost in their role and give them some more role clarity. Mary Beth, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope.
Okay, great. Next slide, please.
All right, so when we travel around the country, when we talk to people who are implementing systems of care for older youth and young adult or transition age young people, what we find is that there is enormous interest and in fact a kind of an explosion in the hiring of young people to be peer support specialists. What we hear from people is that they expect that these young people that are hired will bring their unique strengths into work with other young people. And in particular, for example, they see peer support providers as having kind of a unique type of credibility, so that when they go to do outreach or provide information about services and supports, young people might be more willing to hear the message that these are things that could be helpful to them. We also see people who are intending to use peer supports in roles that model and teach skills to the young people they work with. So for example, they might be teaching young people and modeling skills for sort of general activities in the community, such as using public transportation, going out to visit like community college or workplaces, and also maybe helping them learn about how to attend appointments or events. We also see interest in having peer supports work with young people around skills for working productively and getting what they need from providers, from family, from adult allies, from other people in the community, and generally how to approach goal setting, problem solving, and staying motivated through the ups and downs that happen inevitably as part of life, and particularly in this phase of life. So the question is all of this optimism about what peers can do, is it really warranted? And we, of course, as researchers, naturally want to look at the research and see what that says. And this is part of what motivated us to produce this particular paper in the State of the Science series. Is focused completely on what the research says about peer support for youth and young adults who experience serious mental health conditions. So I recommend, if you're at all interested in this topic and want to have an in-depth discussion of what the research does and doesn't say, to access this. The link will be in the chat, both I think now and as well as at the end of the talk. So just to sum up some of the main points, the sad thing is that the research is not really definitive on most of the interesting questions that we might have about this topic. And particularly, there's not much specific to youth and young adult peer support in mental health, although there is some evidence of positive impact of peer-delivered services in other areas, for example, reproductive health and smoking cessation. There's also a fair amount of work in adult mental health research. But if you go to the most rigorous research summaries and meta-analyses, and these are papers that take a formal approach to synthesizing research across numerous different studies, when they come to their summary statements, they often say things like, there's really not any evidence that peer support works. However, these research studies, these and things like meta-analyses, are typically only focused on randomized studies. If you look at more broadly at research, and this can be very well carried out research as well, it's not that the research is necessarily inferior, you do see evidence of impacts in areas that might be, say, more subjective, for example, feelings of recovery, empowerment, and self-efficacy, but also impacts in areas that involve social participation, social inclusion, and social networks. So what's missing from the literature is first a sort of really good answers to some of these questions, but also a specification maybe of how youth and young adult peer support particularly might be different from peer support that's provided for adults. And also really generally a discussion of what is it that's unique to the peer support role. And we in our projects call this peerness. What is it about peerness that makes it a different kind of interaction, or that lends some unique flavor to what's being offered, and how do we measure that or attach it to the specific outcomes that we expect to see? Next slide, please. And this is just a sort of a pointer to our Focal Point magazine that also has short versions of the State of the Science summaries. I would recommend, if you're interested in the topic in depth, to go to the full State of the Science, but this is another version. Next, please. So one question that, of course, occurs to me when I look at this research is, why isn't the research better? Why doesn't it give better answers to our questions? And really, this idea of role clarity is absolutely the top thing that emerges when you look at the commentaries that they come up with at the end. And here are some actual quotes. Here's one from a more research talking about that there is the lack of clarity is a main barrier to better research and wider and more effective implementation of peer support. And here's another one that says, from a slightly different angle, that peer support providers themselves are unclear about their roles and tasks. So I think, as Caitlin mentioned just a moment ago, neither of these is optimal. So what can we do about developing more specification of the peer role, while, as Caitlin also mentioned, keeping it flexible, keeping it approachable, and making sure that we're not accidentally getting rid of what's actually most valuable about peer support.
I have
go ahead.
I had this is Mary Beth. I had the opportunity to work with a near peer when I was a youth, who was pretty good at having that role clarity. She was very specifically youth-led and made sure that I knew the entire time that she was working specifically with my goals, not my team's goals. And so even though what we did together was looking for a job, I didn't want to look for a job, but I knew that I needed to look for a job, and so I was the one that put that goal forward instead of my team being like, hey, you need to find a job, and telling Summer, hey, you need to help her get a job, get applications, all that kind of stuff. Because I was the one leading the process, she was able to work with me on that, and focus on her role that was working with me, not doing what the team told her that I needed to do.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more about why role clarity and a lack of specification for the peer support role could be a problem. When we are not clear about what the peer support provider is supposed to do, we're not sure about exactly why what they do is supposed to lead to outcomes, what those outcomes should really be. And again, as I mentioned before, what is it that's specifically unique to being a peer that is going to lead, or more likely to lead, to specific kinds of outcomes. And I think we'd already talked a little bit about some of these, but when you don't have role clarity, it's very difficult to decide, to assess the fidelity of what's going on. You don't know whether the person is doing the peer support role as you intend or not. And that, of course, is obvious that you can see how that makes research more difficult, because if you get a null effect, you don't know whether it's because the person didn't do the peer support role in the optimal way, or whether in fact because the role that you specified isn't really working out. Also makes it difficult to do supervision if it's not clear exactly what the peer support provider is supposed to do. And it can make it very confusing to other people in the organization to understand why this person is there, what they're doing, and how their job is different from other roles in the organization. Next, please. So that, with all of that in mind, sorry, we set out to create this project we call AMP+. And what our goal was really to provide a model that's both flexible, as we mentioned before, so that it's useful in different contexts, but sufficiently specified that it can be, that there can be fidelity assessment of what we're asking people to do. So what we decided is to create a model that would be useful for peer support specialists who are working with young people on kind of any kind of person-centered planning. And we call it an enhancement because it could be compatible with a variety of different interventions or programs that have a core person-centered planning element. So for example, we could see a peer support provider doing this kind of support for person-centered planning in collaboration with one other person, say primarily so that could be a clinician, a care coordinator, a transition facilitator, or it could be a peer support working with a team like wraparound or coordinated specialty care. Or in other cases, a peer support provider is working in a generally peer support, sorry, I'm getting my things mixed up here. So when a peer support provider is working in person-centered planning, but the peer is the lead in carrying that out, and we see that model increasingly being taken up in drop-in centers. So what we wanted to do was, again, clarify the role. What is your role in all of this planning? How do you do it? And to also focus on having the peer supports working with young people to get skills for working productively with other people, and that includes people we call gatekeepers who have access to resources, as well as allies and other kinds of friends and supporters. And then generally to make and carry out plans and activities in the community that are linked to goals that the young person finds personally meaningful. And then the other aspect of this that we'll get into in a moment is that we wanted to make sure that we implemented training and coaching for peers that would be most likely, according to what we know about effective training and coaching approaches, to actually get them to a point where their skills were enhanced. Next slide, please. So just taking a small step backwards, AMP Plus is a kind of an extension and adaptation of our original Achieve My Plan intervention enhancement. It's actually also, we call it a skills enhancement intervention. And that was, we did a randomized study of it. I'm not going to go into great detail of the original AMP, but we did find that young people who received wraparound with AMP, so that was a coaching model, they got coaches from Portland State University to work with them, had a variety of outcomes that were superior to wraparound without Achieve My Plan. Our findings, as it shows here, strongly favored the intervention condition in terms of young people's participation and engagement, as well as their alliance with the team, which is sort of a general measure of therapeutic alliance generalized to the team, and that all participants found that the team meetings were more productive and better. So that includes young people as well as other team members, their families and caregivers, as well as other providers. So we found that about actually half of the coaches that we supplied to work with the young people in this AMP study were in fact peers, but we had not created a specifically peer support model. So what we wanted to do was to take the original AMP and make it into a peer support variant that was a little bit more intentional about how to capitalize on peerness. So I believe that we have another poll coming up here. And again, we're going to ask you to get your vote quickly. We're asking you about a challenge or experience that you've had with implementing peer support. And if you've never done it, you can use your imagination to think about what you might expect would be difficult as far as implementation. So the peers don't know what to do. They're not supported by the organization. They're not accepted by colleagues and other staff. lack of professional development opportunities, or just generally less experience with jobs and the workforce.
Of the poll, we had 27% on the last one that youth, they have less workforce experience. And then there were sort of split between the other responses, all between 16 and 19%.
Okay. So as I mentioned or previewed a little bit earlier, we are very concerned about ensuring that the trainings that we provide are likely to actually help people out by teaching them skills that they need and to sustain those skills over the long term. And what we know from and actually it's really just becoming increasingly obvious from, again, a lot of research, is that there are a number of attributes of training and coaching that need to be in place if you want to actually see practice change. So without these in place, in fact, practice change is very unlikely to occur. And so some of the researchers refer to this as a so-called gold standard of training and coaching. And these are some of the key elements that are characterize the gold standard. So first of all, there is observation of the trainee doing the actual practice with the actual people that they're going to be working with. And this can be a live observation, or it can be a sort of so-called observation by audio or video recording. Then they need to get feedback, but not just any feedback. It actually kind of has to be objective, which means that it's reliable, so that if we had 3 different providers of feedback giving that feedback, it would be the same feedback, not just sort of random suggestions about how you could do better. And then there needs to be some criterion for mastery such that you meet a benchmark, or you're able to demonstrate, again, in some by some reliable rating system, that you have actually mastered the material and are kind of good to go with that. So in the AMP Plus study, we were very pleased that we were able to train our university students, again, who served as the coaches in the AMP study, in about 6 weeks, and then to use them in this study that had really pretty good findings. And so what we took from that is not only that we like the general AMP approach, but also that we think we had a really good process for training them to become effective at the job. And that our overall approach included all of these aspects, and we're going to talk in some detail about this later. But where we see this as particularly promising is in giving a cost-effective way of getting to this gold standard training and coaching, because providing all of these elements typically has been so expensive that it's been a real barrier, even as people recognize that this is the way that things optimally should happen. Next, please. And just to point out, again, I think that this link is going to appear in your chat, that we have another state of the science, which I also recommend, that talks about what we know about skill building, training, coaching, etc., for providers working with youth and young adults who experience serious mental health conditions. Next, please. All right, you guys.
So next we're going to talk a little bit about what peer support specialists actually learn as a part of the AMP Plus enhancement. So what we try to teach in AMP Plus is a specific set of techniques that peer support specialists can use in order to maintain conversations that are youth-driven, strengths-based, and promote engagement throughout, and also use the appropriate amount of peerness. And we'll talk about that more in detail in just a little bit. So the structure in which we expect peers to use these techniques are set up into different modules that are pretty flexible, that are built to support young persons' acquisition of self-determination skills. So the idea being is that through using these youth-driven, strengths-based engagement techniques, peer support specialists are able to help young people build self-determination skills in order to reach their dreams and goals. Next slide, please. So the guiding philosophy for this is called guiding without leading. And we like to use our little analogy here of the elephant on the ball. So the idea behind guiding without leading is that you're using engagement techniques that help provide some structure for the young person to guide them into thinking about some of their dreams, goals, support that they may need, as well as ways that they're going to access this support and creating a plan to reach their dreams and goals. It's really difficult to maintain this balance. Oftentimes we can see providers who are using both too much leading and too little guiding at the same time. So the idea is that through the mastery of the AMP techniques, you're able to really honor guiding without leading and just provide that basic structure to allow the young person to lead their own team-based planning process. Do you have anything to add on that, Mary Beth?
Just kind of that was mirrored in my work with the near peer when I was younger as well. Like I was talking earlier about looking for a job, she was able to work with me around what I wanted, what kind of dreams I had for a job, and work on coming up with getting my team on board for looking for maybe that kind of a job instead of what they thought I should be doing and that kind of a thing.
Excellent. Next slide, please. So this is the basic structure of some of the elements of AMP. Again, we love to use our elephants as a metaphor here. So what you'll see in each box is the self-determination skills that we are aiming to teach youth. This includes strengths, dreaming, narrowing down, identifying support, also including things like taking action, meeting with gatekeepers in their team, agenda planning. So lots of things that we see as key ingredients for young people to be able to learn and practice in order to achieve their own success. The idea is that youth are learning these self-determination skills as coaches are using the AMP techniques. So as you can see indicated by the arrow at the bottom, AMP techniques are used throughout each process so that young people can learn the self-determination skills. I know that we don't have the techniques listed, but some of them include things like open-ended questions, reflections, descriptive praise. We also have more advanced techniques like using your peerness, normalizing, and keeping it conversational. Our techniques are often intertwined, so we have some foundational techniques that lead into your mastery of the advanced techniques that, again, connect to young people being able to inhabit these self-determination skills. And you'll see at the top we have our modules listed. This includes vision to activity, planning for a meeting, and then doing the meeting and or the activity. So these are the structured modules that we've created in which, again, coaches are using these techniques to help teach these self-determination skills to young people. The idea, too, is that it's an ongoing process. So you're not doing each module and then saying, okay, we're done, you've learned it. It's cyclical, it keeps going, and we'll talk about that cycle a little bit more. Next slide, please.
So this is just kind of a visual of what the cycle looks like. You start with vision to activity where you work on those, that dreaming, that narrowing down of setting a goal, and coming up with activities to do to work towards your dream. There's also preparing for a meeting next, which is any kind of meeting that can come up in your youth work. That includes maybe a team meeting, getting everybody on board with the same goal that the young person has. Or maybe the young person wants to learn how to play the guitar, and so they need a one-on-one meeting to with somebody to see if they can take guitar lessons. Or you know, just anything that comes up. Maybe they need to meet with a college advisor. So it can be preparing for any type of meeting from a one-on-one to a big team-type meeting. And then after that, you carry out like one or more activities. So that can be a community activity where you are going and picking up applications for a job, or going and checking out a guitar shop that does guitar lessons and finding out information. Or they meet with a gatekeeper who might be like, again, an advisor at a college, or they're meeting with their team, like I said. So those are the three kind of beginning pieces. And then there's the booster, which basically works as a debrief to be like, okay, so how did that go? And how do we want to move forward working on this? And then you can go back to vision to activity if the young person either completes their goal or finished or decides that maybe that isn't what they want to do. Maybe they don't want to learn how to play guitar. They want to learn how to, like, they want to join a soccer club or something like that. And so then you go through the process again. And this is meant to be able to be used and applied to many different ideas and dreams, and if not all different ideas, dreams, goals, narrowing those down and working through the process. Next slide, please. So I kind of explained this a little bit. There's some, those are the different modules, and the self-determination skills are connecting to like your own motivation, narrowing down from goals, from dreams to goals to activities to action steps that you can actually like bite-sized pieces to complete that. When you're working on preparing for a meeting, that's when the peer talks about things like anticipating the situation, coming up with a plan B. Goldilocks is a self-determination skill as well, which is kind of like figuring out how to provide the right amount of support to the young person without leading too much or not leading enough, getting completely off track, that kind of stuff. And then also talking about positive communication. And then in the booster or debrief, you do all of it. And it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. So you can check in with the young person and be like, all right, what do you want to work on today? Do you want to do more dreaming, more goal planning? Do you have a meeting coming up? That kind of stuff.
Next slide, please. So again, bringing it back to the modules that we have here, you're doing all of these things in a cyclical way that keeps rotating. And I think that we have an animation here, if you wanted to click next, Emily. So as you can see, well, the other circle wasn't supposed to disappear, but that's okay. We'll improvise. But the idea being is that these are a continually rotating process. So as Mary Beth mentioned, you're applying these to each of the different goals. And something that I also want to highlight is while we have structured modules that do this, I always encourage people to continue using the techniques that they use in the AMP process outside of a structured module. You can have these conversations in a way that is still use-driven, that is still structured, and still utilizes guiding without leading. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about now is peerness. I know that we've mentioned this a few times throughout this presentation. So peerness is not just about the sharing of your own story, which I know that many of the peer support specialists and probably their managers are very familiar with who are on this webinar, but it's also about how do you maintain engagement and connection with the young person. So as we know, peer support specialists are usually peers or near peers. So being around the same age, they get to engage around youth culture. Sometimes I think we often forget that youth culture is its own thing. There are different norms, values, practices, and communication, and near peers or peers are really able to connect with youth in this way. So it's not just about having the same lived experience, but it's also about having similar knowledge and experience with things like media, pop culture, technology, and other stuff.
For an example, I had the opportunity to work with a young person as I was training to be a peer support specialist, and I was co-coaching with somebody who was older and was not a peer, and she was training me, so we would both meet with the young person that I was working with, and it was interesting to see the dynamics of he and I had really good peerness, and she kind of was there as a teacher kind of person, helping facilitate, and like, because at that point I didn't have all of the role clarity that I could use, and needed a little bit of help staying on track getting stuff done, honestly. But we had a really, really great set, like great setup around peerness of he and I connected. We could watch Minecraft videos, and he would tell me about this new music video, and I'd tell him about a new like random video that I saw on YouTube. Cat videos were shared because I love cats, and like that kind of a thing. But we were able to do it in a way that was like, that wasn't what our meeting was around. We were able to go off topic a little bit and then kind of bring it back around. And so when we were working on something that maybe was tough for him, we could like pull up a video and like get distracted for a second and then come back on task. And that was something that I knew what was relevant. And there were times where the co-coach that I was working with was like, "What are you talking about?" And it kind of became a joke of like, well, Mary Beth gets it kind of a thing. And that helped with building our connection and our engagement, that like when he ended up going through a really tough time, I was the person that he let in and allowed to like come and visit him when he needed a visitor and stuff like that, because we had that unique shared understanding and also had been able to like put fun stuff in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Some more information on peerness. We have a handy dandy tool that you can use here at Pathways. We love creating tools and publications that you guys can access. So if you go to our website, you'll see that there is a tool called What is Peer Support and What is Not Peer Support. Again, intended to help with some of the role clarity that we know that peers, their managers, and their team members often face. So due to the interpersonal nature of their work, youth peer support benefit from a flexible structure that allows them to create boundaries with their youth. This is something that, again, we really tried to aim to create with the AMP Plus module. It's a flexible structure that still allows them to adhere to their role and help create some of those boundaries. I don't know if many of you have experienced this, but I know that when I was a peer support specialist, and at first I did not have many tools or much direction on what my role was supposed to be, oftentimes boundaries would get blurred with my young people where they would think that I was their best friend, things of that nature. The beauty about peer relationships is you do have that reciprocal relationship, but you do also want to set those boundaries of being a paid provider for that young person. You're not necessarily somebody who is supposed to be their very close friend. You're still somebody who's working with them, but you share a reciprocal relationship. So AMP Plus, again, kind of creates some more of that structure so you can maintain some of those boundaries. Excuse me. Also, we want to make sure that peers get to practice strategic sharing in a way that is safe for them, that's still youth-driven and helps build hope without telling the youth how to do something or how to be. We, I think, all know that sometimes sharing our story, there's a time and a place for that. So that's something that you want to build in with your peerness as well. And then the youth peer is also able to help normalize the young person's experience through some shared understanding. So by having that lived experience, even if it might not be the same lived experience or the same story as the young person, you can still normalize some of the things that they may be going through because you have that shared understanding that's developed by peerness. Next slide, please.
I think Caitlin just kind of covered most of this, but peerness it's important to remember that that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the same lived experience as the young person you're working with. And also, the emphasis is more on having that empathy and shared understanding of like being in a system, not necessarily, yeah, I've been through that specific like that I've been through this many foster homes and you've been through this many foster homes kind of a thing. It's like, yes, I've been in the mental health system, I've been in the foster care system. I know that those systems are shitty, and I understand that you're having to deal with that right now, and I get it, kind of a thing. Next slide, please.
So bringing that back to the AMP training process, as we had mentioned earlier, we have a specific process that we use for training that we call the gold standard of coaching. It's about learning the module first, so that's what participants do. Then they get to observe some skilled practice. Then they practice doing the module themselves, get specific feedback from a trained coach on their practice, and then you rinse and repeat. Next slide, please. So one of the tools that we use in order to do this module is called the virtual coaching platform. It allows trainees to submit video of their actual practice for trainers to review. Trainers can then observe that practice minute by minute and provide direct feedback regarding specific techniques and benchmarks that they are looking for their trainees to reach. Trainers can then generate a feedback report and create clips of strengths and improvables for users to view, and then the trainer can provide specific coaching related to strengths and improvables. So what's super cool about this is that you can actually have people watch your practice and provide that direct feedback, so you're learning how to change your practice with really, really specific coaching. I know that when I was a peer support specialist, this was immensely valuable to me because it was more than just about learning philosophy and trying to apply that to my practice, but not really knowing if I was doing it or not. I actually got feedback on when I was doing it well and where I had areas to grow. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of our virtual coaching platform, so you get a little taste of what it looks like and how we can code for specific things to measure in people's practice. Next slide, please. This is what the feedback report looks like for trainees. So you get a feedback report, and as you can see, specific techniques are outlined over to the left, and then there's specific feedback related to that technique over in the right. As you can see, the techniques over to the left, those are all blue links. So when you're looking at your feedback report, you can also go click on that link and actually watch the minute that you are getting that feedback on. It is super cool, and I really can't highlight enough how much it helps you learn in your practice. Albeit a little nerve-wracking, really super valuable in training. Next slide, please.
All right.
And with that, over to Janet.
Okay, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about our actual study. You can see it was a relatively small study. We had 31 peers participating, and we looked at, for our outcomes, we looked at their extent to which they were doing the new practices, so based on video recordings, but also we looked at surveys of their perceived self-efficacy and doing specific elements of the role. We looked at their role and job anxiety ratings and role clarity. So those were pre and post survey training, and they also had a I'm very curious about this. So we did some retrospective assessments. So during the post follow-up survey, we asked people to also rate how they remembered being before the training started. As I mentioned, we had scoring of the first and the final videos, and then we used the IOTTA elements of that. It's the impact of training and technical assistance survey that we use a lot around the country, and it looks at training satisfaction. We did this about 1 month in and after the training was completed. Next, please. So just getting a little bit at the skills and self-efficacy. So they were rated by the peers, the trainees, on a 1 to 100 scale using a very common approach that has been implemented in a lot of self-efficacy studies. 4 general areas, good reliability of the subscales. And 3 of these 4 areas are very similar to those in original AMP. And again, we measured it pre, post, and retrospective. Next, please. So the actual areas that we're looking at in the skills self-efficacy are are these. So first, we're looking at a youth-driven approach. So we ask in our a survey that people are responding to, we ask them, how confident are you that you can ... And so the first area, youth-driven approach, has a series of items on it that include things like this. How confident are you that you can help a young person to better understand their own goals, ideas, and priorities. In the strengths approach, how confident are you that you can, for example, help a young person identify abilities and accomplishment that they are generally proud of? And for self-determination skills, we have several examples here, but help them figure out how to take action to accomplish things they find important, how to help a young person prepare for a conversation with a gatekeeper, help a young person improve their abilities, their skills in asking for help from their allies. Next, please. So then we also have some questions on there for self-efficacy related to peerness. And you'll see, so again, how confident are you that you can set boundaries so that you are clear and comfortable about what is part of your role as a peer and what isn't. Be clear about how your relationship with a young person is different from a friendship or from other therapeutic relationships. We find this is a big thing, actually. And talk about your own experiences or your story in a way that's helpful to the young people you work with. Next, please. So as far as those go, if you look at baseline, so that's the pre and post, you will see that in each of the areas, people had significant difference. That's what's indicated by the little asterisks there, that people themselves rated themselves higher in each of these areas as well as kind of overall. And what's interesting here too, I'm always very curious about retrospective ratings, that we found that in each area, people also at the end thought that their skills were lower than they had originally rated. And I actually think that this is something of a real phenomenon, because as you become more expert and sort of a better critique or critic of your own practice, you realize that you knew less than you thought you did when you started out. And this can be a problem for training because you know, it's difficult for people to accurately rate themselves when they're not really experts. So anyway, it's an interesting finding to me. Next, please. So we also rated in those same areas their performance on our videos. And so this was from an early video, so they get some practice videos, and then we look at the first kind of real one. And we saw improvements significant in each of these areas. So we see youth-driven, connection skills, keeping it on track, which is doing a person-centered planning, some part of it in a way that keeps moving forward and accomplishing something. We did not see significant improvement in strengths, which is interesting. Strengths was somewhat higher than some of the other areas to start out with. It didn't really change that much over time, so it's something that we have been beefing up since we did this initial study. Next, please. We also asked people about role conflicts. So this has to do with, for example, whether different supervisors or bosses at work have different ideas about what I should be doing. So, you know, are there different views about how that should be? Then role clarity, you've heard us talk about this a lot. And of course, we were very curious to examine this, which is I kind of basically focused on how well everybody understands what you're supposed to be doing. So I have a clear sense of how well my supervisor thinks I'm doing my job. And then we also had one about work anxiety, which is really, do people feel comfortable that they're doing a good job? You can see the example there, it basically says exactly that. Next, please. So what we found when we looked at pre and post on these was that role conflict actually went up. And I'll talk to you, I'm going to come back to that in a second. And that was significant. Also saw that role clarity, which is what we were hoping, went up significantly, and that work anxiety went down significantly, which is also good. What we came to believe about role clarity was, role conflict was essentially that because the supervisors didn't know that much about the AMP Plus, and it was sort of variable with how much they were kind of paying attention to it, that it actually seemed fairly reasonable that role conflict might go up. So I think which points to a need to really pay attention to training people in the broader context and getting everybody kind of on the same page about what the expectations are. Next, please. So finally, we had some aspects of training satisfaction that we were looking at. The first two aren't really satisfaction, but it just has to do with the fact that, again, people rated their mastery of the material when we asked them in this way, also higher at the second time than the first. But the importance of training goals, almost 8 on the scale of 10. Trainer credibility, 9.1, which is really pretty astounding, frankly. Organization and confidence that they can apply. I think this is kind of an important thing to be looking at. So this was from the POST survey, that they were quite convinced that they could apply what they were learning in their day-to-day work with young people. And this was after a training that lasted over a period of 4 or 5 months. So they had obviously had a chance to start applying it. So this is actually, based on some experience with using the AMP Plus approach. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin to do our last poll here.
Okay, everybody. So our last poll, we're interested in learning a little bit about what future peer support webinar topics you would like to see. So what does a young adult peer support specialist do? What training do young adult peer support specialists need? How do you supervise young adult peers? How do you avoid turnover? And then ensuring that other roles work successfully with young adult peers. Please just take a few seconds to answer.
And if you want to chat in more details, we'd love that too.
Oh, cool. So it looks like our highest rated is 42%, so ensuring that other roles work successfully for young adult peers. And then we have 19%, how do you supervise young adult peers? And then 15% and under for what does a young adult peer support specialist do, avoiding turnover, and what do they need? Excellent, thank you. Well, a little bit about what is on our next slide, and I believe that this has been chatted into you as well. We have a brand new Achieve My Plan website where you can go and learn more about not just the AMP Plus peer module, but the other AMP modules that we have as well. So displayed there, you'll see that we have original AMP, AMP for transition facilitators, and then AMP for facilitators, as well as our AMP Plus for young adult peers. It's a good way to just learn about more about the enhancement and also to get in touch with any of us if you're interested in more information on the training.
We do have at least one question. During the part where you were presenting the results, Janet, we had a question from Catherine wondering about what kind of objective criteria. I'm not sure if that gives you enough to respond to.
Well, it may have to do with how we do our coding of the videos. So we have really attempted to make sure that we have reliable feedback. In other words, that we have we do ratings on the techniques, and then we provide overall ratings in each of those areas that I noted. So strengths-based, youth-driven, etc. And we do train people so they get to practice coding on VCP. They practice coding video, and we have a feature in VCP that lets them compare how they coded and annotated any segment or overall of the video versus the expert coding. So when we have a new person that starts to work, we can assign them coding videos, practice coding videos to learn until they are coding at a level that is acceptable as far as its reliability. So, that's what we talked about before, the need for there to be enough of a specification around the expectations so that different people hold the same expectations, and when different people observe the same practice, they are seeing the same things as far as what's going well and what's not going well, so that everybody can feel confident that the feedback that they're getting is the feedback that they would receive from any person who is sufficiently expert. I hope that answers the question. Feel free to type in if you didn't hear at the beginning. We're doing questions by chat, so if you have questions, you are welcome to chat them into the chat box.
Someone would like access to the instruments you used in the evaluation. Is that linked to them or to the studies?
You are welcome to email me directly if you would like to get those assessments, or actually you could do the pathways. Emily, can you put the pathways, what's that called? The dissemination email into the chat box for people to see? What is that? Pubs, RTC pubs, or is that the good one? Yeah, okay. So yes, we're happy to share those.
Another person asked, what does AMP stand for again?
So that's Achieve My Plan. And that was the name of the original study. We actually developed the AMP study in collaboration with young people. They liked the acronym of AMP for amplifying their voice in the treatment planning process. So you can see, actually, I guess you can't see because we don't have it up there, but we have a nifty little AMP logo that has a kind of an amplification theme to it, I guess.
I think the slides and recording will be posted on our site within a day or two, so everyone will be able to access those. And we'll include the links to the resources again as well.
All right, well, that's handy since we're pretty much at the end of our hour. I would like to thank our panelists and also Emily and everyone who attended. Thanks for being on, and we'll be in touch for your impressions about the webinar at some point in the future. And we appreciate if you do the little short survey that we have. It's always helpful for us to know how we could improve and what is going well. Thanks.